I think Nebraska may have finally evolved and gained a clutch gene. Maybe I'm wrong there, but Cincinnati clearly wanted that game. You could see it as the game progressed and evolved, as Cincinnati was able to hang around. And after they stopped Dylan Raiola and Dana Holgerson and the Nebraska passing offense on that 4th and 2 around the Cincinnati 45, nearly a pick six for Cincinnati as Dylan Raiola progressed through his reads. I think he had Dane Key open over the middle. Was he wide open? No. But Key was good enough in that game to make a possession catch as he was getting thrown and convert that 4th down. Instead, he nearly threw a pick six to Cincinnati. That shifted the momentum. That was the play, not on the defense. If the defense ended up, for example, surrendering that 30-yard pass that was intercepted, but rather surrendered it for a touchdown at the end of the game to make it 24-20 Nebraska, I think the defense ultimately played about as well as they realistically could. It would have been on the offense and on that 4th down had Nebraska lost, in my mind. That gave Cincinnati confidence. They marched down. They figured out if they ran up-tempo and then ran the rock and pounded the rock, that Nebraska couldn't really do all that much to stop them. And that's something that we said in the preview and prediction for this game, is that Nebraska was the better team and they should win, and they would have an air attack advantage, but Cincinnati would have the rushing attack edge. Back to what I said about the clutch gene, though. Cincinnati wanted that game. You could see it in their emotions, in their body language. They knew, even though their defense was on the field for 40 minutes and their offense was constantly sputtering out of control and couldn't do much early on, once they found the formula, they thought they were going to win. They knew that they could win. It didn't matter that Nebraska fans had packed the loudest stadium in the world and that the environment was honestly louder than Memorial Stadium. It didn't matter. But what did matter is that Nebraska had enough good players and enough players with a clutch gene inside of them to make a play and to win. Malcolm Hartzog Jr. is an older player who has been through the culture change of Matt Rhule, who has witnessed that. And on a play like that under Scott Frost, Cincinnati probably finds a way to make a possession catch in the end zone, and Nebraska, allows defeat to occur. Defeat snatches victory away from Nebraska yet again. And yet this didn't happen. Even with Dylan Raiola having some struggles through the air, even with Cincinnati, I think putting Nebraska's offensive line in a bit of a blender for much of the game. Emmett Johnson played well. He averaged 4.3 yards per carry. But I think while in some respects that was on his offensive line, they looked really good at times. I think this is the best Nebraska offensive line I've seen in a bit. Cincinnati had the size and the personnel to where they lined up in a 3-3-5 and only had a three-man front, and at times really wrecked that unit. And they got pressure on Raiola. They were able at times to get Emmett Johnson in the backfield. I mean, they had 6 TFLs, 3 sacks. Nebraska had no sacks and 2 TFLs. I would argue that if Cincinnati had Harrison Wallace III at wide receiver, who's just an okay wide receiver from Penn State, or if they also had Dylan Raiola at quarterback, there is a chance that they may have won, but they did not, because the story of this game is that Nebraska was clutch. They were the better team. They were, in my opinion, the better coached team. I think Cincinnati executed better relative to who they are, and maybe if they had some fundamentally different pieces and players on their team, they would have won. But that's not how college football works. You have to work with what you have. You have to coach with what you have. And I think at the end of the day, Nebraska did a better job of that. So Nebraska wins a close game, 20-17 Cornhusker victory in Arrowhead Stadium. Make sure before we resume this video that you like, that you subscribe, that you hit the notification bell. That way you can get notified when I do more of these semi-instant reactions, maybe the night of, but more likely than not released on the following morning of the game. And I'm also going to do a little bit of a more deeper dive reacting to this game. I want to watch it again, parts of it, and learn a little bit more, because there are some key takeaways I have. But this game was really interesting. It was close. There is definitely something that I missed because I only watched it once. So hit the notification bell on my channel and also the Nebraska Football podcast if you want to get notified for when that is up. I wanted to give Cincinnati some flowers at the beginning of this video, and the reason I wanted to do that is just how they performed in this game and how they fought. So let me go through some of the game statistics for you. We recapped how the game went, Nebraska's clutchness, and the fact that this team is going to win close games. That is how they're reaching the playoff. Many have predicted them to. I have them as kind of a, one of the first two, one of the first four out type team. If they are going to the playoffs, they are going to be winning several games like this. Nebraska had the ball for 39 minutes and 30 seconds with 77 plays. They had a 23 play advantage over Cincy, and they had Cincy's defense on the field for 40 minutes and only put up 20 points. And they failed on a fourth down. They had some issues where drives were stalled due to penalties from a mostly experienced offensive line. Some transfers, yes, but you get the point. Rhule was missing receivers at times. Other times plays broke down. Other times he was under pressure, and obviously when any quarterback is under pressure, they are going to perform worse. Nebraska controlled the game via the stat sheet, but they did not use their statistical advantage and really stamina advantage. When you run that many plays, the opposing defense should be a lot more exhausted than Cincinnati's defense looked for much of the game. So on the surface level, they controlled Cincinnati. But if you actually watch the game, they were just ahead of Cincinnati, and Cincinnati had to play catch-up, and there's a difference there. Nebraska dominated through the air. I liked what I saw out of Key, out of Hunter. They definitely have better receivers than last year. They can actually, catch the ball in contested catch situations. There was a reason that Cincinnati was playing their safeties and defensive backs well off, whether in man coverage or zone coverage, and they ran more zone. There's a reason for that, because their DBs are smaller and not as talented. That's a credit to DeKeel Shorts, a credit to Matt Rhule, a credit to Dana Holgorsen, where Tyson Veit, Cincinnati's defensive coordinator, decided, hey, we need to sit back. We need to play bend but don't break here, because these guys can break us over the top. Nebraska didn't have that issue, because Nebraska's DBs were about the same size or bigger and more athletic than Cincinnati's wide receivers. The air advantage was clear. That's why Cincinnati only averaged 2.8 yards through the air. And Nebraska, with what I would say was somewhat of an off night for Dylan Rhule, I think he'll get better as the year goes on, they averaged 5.8 yards per carry. But the rushing offense, this was the story of the game in a certain sense. This is the only reason why Cincinnati was even in it at the end, as it became clear they couldn't pass the football, and Nebraska was doing well enough on the ground and well enough through the air to consistently stay in the lead and maintain that 13-3 halftime lead, along with the turnovers. Nebraska being +2 in turnovers and winning a close game. Again, circling back to that clutchness there, Nebraska simply made the game-breaking plays more than Cincinnati did. That's why they won. It's a credit to coaching. That is a credit to development. It's a credit to player experience. However, Nebraska, despite having a 100% power rushing success when they needed to run the ball in clutch situations, they succeeded. And the offensive line for Nebraska ultimately got push for the majority of the day. I think a large part of that had to do with the fact they had a numbers advantage in the box. Part of the reason why Cincinnati had success too, although they had much more of it. They had 6.7 yards per carry. Nebraska had 3.6. Both in the short, down and distance rushing attack succeeded, but Cincinnati was more explosive. And Cincinnati was able to have better success on the outside because I think their tackles and tight ends did a better job of blocking. They also gave up no sacks, while Nebraska gave up 3. But to be fair, Nebraska was passing the ball a whole lot more, and Sorsby's more mobile than Rhule. Sorsby was also very, I would say, a little bit too aware, a little bit anxious in the pocket. Whenever Nebraska stunted or whenever they sent pressure, he typically rolled out and gave up on the play pretty early. But Cincinnati won the line of scrimmage here. That is a key story of this game, is that the Bearcats, they ultimately won on the lines. Was it by a lot? No. And Nebraska dominated through the air in a way that Cincinnati did not dominate on the ground. Again, Nebraska was the better team. That's why they had that many more plays, that much more time of possession. That's why often when Nebraska was driving to score, it felt like they were going to put the game away. And while Cincinnati was driving to score, it felt like they were staying in it and just hanging around. But at the end of the day, Cincinnati, I think, played a pretty fair game, pretty good game relative to their ceiling. Nebraska has a lot to work on. I mean, when you're 10 of 18 on third down, and I'm not trying to be overly critical of Nebraska, I keep mentioning their clutchness, but I think Nebraska fans understand that for Big Ten play, they got to play better than this. 10 of 18 on third down. When you have 18 third down conversions, you're either trying to run a game control offense, or what you are trying to do is you are trying to be explosive, you're trying to have success, and you're just not finding it consistently. And I think it was a little bit of both. Nebraska called a conservative game, and they were trying to control the game, but they also definitely wanted to do some things that they just couldn't end up doing. Definitely some, weird throws, some bad throws, also some really beautiful throws, like that pass to the end zone to make it 13-3 before the half. Beautiful touch, beautiful ball from Rhule. You can see the 5-star talent. Also, a little bit of luck went Cincinnati's way. I know turnovers are typically lucky, and those went Nebraska's way. But Cincinnati was able to convert 2 of their third downs. Nebraska only converted 1 of them. Had Nebraska converted that additional 4th down, the game would have probably been over. But also that makes up a little bit for the turnovers. It was ultimately a really close game. It was a really fun watch. I honestly was just wanting it to be a really good game where at the end of the day, Nebraska won. And they did. And look, Nebraska, I think a key takeaway that you can have from them is they have a lot of talent, they have some potential, and I picked Nebraska to win 10 games while also playing Cincinnati close. So a lot of people are sweating it out, thinking that, oh my gosh, well, this team might be so much worse than I imagined. This is how Nebraska, and Nebraska fans, you should enjoy this because you haven't won this way in so long. This is how Nebraska's going to win games this year in Big Ten play. Like, they'll blow out Akron and Houston Christian, but if you're going to beat Michigan, Michigan State, Minnesota, USC, Iowa, if you are going to beat Michigan State, maybe even Northwestern or Maryland or UCLA, you are going to have to win close contests because this team, at least from where it is now, is not going to be capable of blowing out good opponents. I mean, Arrowhead was 90 to 95% Nebraska fans, if not all Nebraska fans. That's a louder, more intimidating environment as you settle in than Memorial Stadium is, just because it's built to trap noise. And you beat a Cincinnati team who's probably about 500, maybe a little bit better than that, by 3. But Rhule has shown before at Baylor that this guy can win 80 to 90% of his close games if he has the correct roster. And I think Nebraska can do that. The question is, can they be more efficient? And for Cincinnati, it's whether or not their passing game will improve. Because if it doesn't, I imagine there are Big 12 defenses that can defend their style of offense. And I imagine there are some Big 12 offenses that right now are more effective than Nebraska's. I think Nebraska's one of the best teams in the Big 12. If they were in it, I'd be tempted to pick them to win the Big 12 because Nebraska is that good. They do have that much potential and good coaching. But Cincy's passing game was concerning, to say the least. And that brings me to some other key reactions that I have. Nebraska, for one, was just straight up better. They clearly had more talent and led for about 35 minutes. Nebraska's also pretty small. So one of the last things I want to talk about with Nebraska before we get on out of here is their 3-3-5 defense looked more like a 1-5-5 or a 1-4-6. It was a very small front, and I think that is ultimately what gave them problems. Remember what I said earlier in the video where if Nebraska ended up losing, it'd be on the offense, not on the defense. This defense against good rushing offenses is not going to hold you typically to the high teens. It's typically going to allow probably lower 20s, maybe high teens at the best. Holding a team to 3 in Cincinnati with what they had on the ground was probably not realistic with this defense. This is a defense that will not hold teams in Big Ten play to under 20 points per game on average, or maybe even under 24 or 25. This is a defense that is much better at stopping the pass. It's not elite there, but it's pretty darn good, great. I mean, Sear Wright, Malcolm Hartzog, Marquise Buford, Andrew Marshall made a pass breakup early in the game, was pretty good. But the defensive front, especially the D-line, has a lot of questions, and you saw that here. Cincinnati has good lines of scrimmage. I think their O-line is probably the same as Nebraska's, maybe a tad bit worse, but their D-line's much better. You know, Dante Corleone, some of their other players, one of their linebackers, Golday, looked really good. That was the reason why they almost won. Seriously. Rhule also has more work to do. He was indecisive and inaccurate at times. He also showed really good moments, but it looked more like he had progressed once again at the same level that he did from Satterfield to Holgorsen and just made that small bump again throughout the whole preseason instead of making a big leap. It is week 1, and returning production's at an all-time low, so I am going to give him some grace there, but yeah, he does have more work to do, and I'm confident that him and the staff will get it together and produce something better within the next few weeks. And last but not least, Sorsby has absolutely no wide receiver help. None. Now, he's not as good as Rhule. He was more accurate. He was more indecisive. Rhule was the definitively better quarterback. If they both had similar athleticism in the sense of running the ball, like Rhule was as mobile as Sorsby was, and he showed some really good mobility. That was something about Rhule that I was most impressed with of all. He made the year 1 starter to year 2 starter Drew Aller jump, where instead of being a liability in the pocket, you're all of a sudden helping out your offensive line, picking up yards, making sure your sacks aren't 5 or 10 yard losses, but 1 or 2. I loved Rhule's pocket presence, if I'm being honest. I really loved that. Sorsby didn't have exactly that, but it was very close, and the extra mobility really helped him. If Rhule had that, Nebraska probably wins and covers this game, but Sorsby has no wide receiver help. That means one of two things, and we'll figure this out through this month. Nebraska's secondary is either awesome, or Cincinnati's wide receivers suck, or it's somewhere in the middle. I can't wait to figure that out, and ultimately, at the end of the day, Nebraska wins. They, some could say escape, but I think when you have 40 minutes of possession, have the majority of the plays, they didn't necessarily escape, they just simply didn't choke it away. And that's a very encouraging sign. It's very good for Nebraska. As for Cincinnati, if you play Nebraska competitively and Nebraska's maybe better than we think after this game, or if they're as good as I think, then you can actually win the Big 12, provided a few things. So good takeaways for both teams. Nebraska ultimately with the better takeaways because they win. Next up, Nebraska plays Akron. And once again, make sure to like, make sure to subscribe, and hit that notification bell, as I will be doing a deeper dive reaction on this game for Nebraska fans. And as for Cincinnati fans, I'll probably see you soon, depending on who you play in the Big 12. But we'll see. We'll be covering Nebraska weekly, as always.